Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christina Hurlbut, and I am currently in my fourth year as the percussion director at Abilene High School, Mann Middle School, and Craig Middle School in Abilene ISD in Abilene, Texas. Thank you so much for attending my virtual clinic. Please feel free to post any questions you may have in the poll tab throughout the clinic, and we will be answering these at the end in a live Q&A. And you can also download the handout for this clinic in the File tab. Today, we will be talking about tips to a thriving beginning percussion class and kind of what my approach is when I teach my beginning percussion classes. So let's get started. There will be three main topics that I will be talking about. The first will be required materials for the students to have. The second will be the order of processes and the order of topics that I use when I teach my classes. And the third will be the more challenging percussion topics and how to teach them. When I was thinking about a clinic for TMEA, I thought about what people might want to hear the most and what might help current band directors the most. And the first thing that I thought about was that most school districts don't have a percussion specialist like I am in mine. And so I want to give tips on how to teach a beginning percussion class, especially for those middle school band directors who may or may not be a percussionist, but also may not really know how to start a beginning percussion class and kind of how to keep that going throughout the year. So it's my goal in the next half hour that you will feel more prepared to teach your beginning percussion class, and hopefully that you will have some new fun and exciting ways to teach the topics. So to start, all the students need to have some required materials. And the first thing that I have my kids get is a stick bag that is a prepackaged one. So this one that is shown is the IP Fundamental stick bag. Vic Firth also has one like this, and I'm sure there's other companies that do, but they need to have a pair of snare drum sticks, a pair of marimba mallets, a pair of timpani mallets, and a pair of xylophone mallets. I like this bag just because it has the IPLD sticks, and I think those are really great for beginners. You can also have the students buy them separately from Lone Star or Steve Weiss or any music store. The next things that I have my students get would be a book, a pad, and a bell kit. There are several different books on the market for beginning percussion, and the one that we use is the one by Ken and Wiley called Simple Steps to Successful Beginning Percussion. I personally use this with my students because this is the book I was taught out of in 6th grade, and I like that it has snare and mallets in it, and then it also has lessons on different accessories like drum set and timpani and Wiro and shaker and things like that. So I can use those lessons on days when we have extra time or when we need to cover a specific kind of instrument. There are also books like the Wessel's book is very popular, and there's also the Packet by Frank Chappell, but you need to choose the book that works for you. There's also a really good article in the Percussive Arts Society in the Percussive Notes, if you're a member of PAS, and it compares a lot of different snare books and beginning percussion books just to see what kind of material is included in those. In my school district, my students do not have the ability to purchase practice marimbas. So the middle schools provide bell kits for the students to take home during the year and borrow, and then they bring them back at the end of the year. Because of this, they're able to take a bell kit home. But if you live in an area where students could potentially get a practice marimba, I highly recommend doing so because those are more similar to the instruments that the kids will be playing on at school. In addition to the bell kit, I also have my students get a silent practice pad like the one shown and a stand so that they can practice at the right height at home. These seem to work a little better since they're not super loud, and they have a little bit more rebound than like the little hard remo pads that there are. Okay, so these are the teaching topics that I normally go over throughout my entire beginning percussion year. The handout for this clinic will show a year at a glance, and I've basically written down the topics that I'm teaching per week, and then what lesson that actually matches to in the Wiley book. But obviously you do not have to follow it that way. If you want to change up the order, that's completely up to you, and see what works for you and your class. Every teacher is different and every group of students is different. So this is what has worked best for me. Usually at the beginning of the year, after I've auditioned the students over the summer, we have a beginning percussion day camp, and it's usually on a Saturday in August. And it's about 2 to 3 hours, and I have some of my high schoolers come help me with this. And we teach all of my little incoming sixth graders how to set up their drum pads and how to hold the sticks for the first time. And that is literally the only goal of the day. So when we're there, we talk about holding the stick. I'll talk about up and down pizza a little later. And then as school starts, we start getting into how to read notes on a staff and how to count and full strokes. And then we go on into wholes, halves, quarters, and dotted notes. We'll go into eighth notes, eighths rest, and this one is very important. I put a star next to this one because my students seem to have more trouble understanding eighth notes and eighth rests, especially when they're on the upbeat. So I like to spend a little bit more time, especially on this topic, and just review several times so that they really, really understand this. After we've touched on that, we go into repeat signs, 1 bar and 2 bar, keep reviewing dotted quarter notes, and then we get to the 16th notes and 16th note rests. This is probably my favorite thing to teach because at this point, I feel like the students can kind of hold their own a little bit, and we can play eighth notes and quarter notes. And then now we're getting into the more fun, challenging things with 16th notes. So I like to have counting days with those, and I'll come in and just give them a piece of paper that has several random 16th note variations on it, and we just sight count. I like to urge to the kids that this is one of the more important things that I want them to be able to do by the time they get into 7th grade, and they should be amazing counters. After this, we touch on dynamics and stick placement. For you middle school band directors who may or may not be percussionists, this is a very important topic just because dynamics change how high your stick should be. And you really want to make sure that the students understand that the softer they are, the lower they play, and the louder they are, the higher they play. So that is something we touch on at that point. Continuing, we go into diddles. This is going to be one of the topics I talk about in a little bit. And so I'll talk about that later. But we talk about diddles and what a slash through the note means. And then this is where I like to start introducing mallets. There are several different thoughts on this as well, and when to introduce mallets into your class, but I have found that my kids do a lot better when I have at least gotten through 16th notes with them on pad, and then they can take all of those fundamentals that they learned on the pad and then apply it to the mallets. And then it's a whole lot easier transition for me and for them, especially because a lot of them do not want to learn mallets. So after we've touched on mallets and learning what a whole scale is, or a major scale, and what scale degrees are, and tetrachords, that's like the bulk of the beginning of mallets. We touch on like learning octaves on a marimba and what ledger lines are and how to read notes with ledger lines and accidentals. And then at this point, I actually like to skip a little forward and go on to the 4 main stroke types. It kind of gives the kids a break with all the heavy stuff, especially with mallets and scales and diddles and rolls. So I like to touch on the downs, the taps, the ups, and the full strokes. After we've done that, we talk about accents, whether it's on one hand or between the hands. And then from there, we kind of finish out the year and we're learning double stops and key signatures. We start with flam rudiments, and the main rudiments that we learn during 6th grade are flams, flam taps, and flammed accents. And then we learn how to incorporate the rudiments into the music. We learn more rolls. We learn 13-stroke rolls, 17-stroke rolls, and buzz rolls. And the transition between the open rolls and the buzz rolls is very important as well. Continuing on, and we go into mallet rolls, 16th note rhythms on keyboard, and then eventually we finish out the year with learning about triplets and 16th note triplets, and then learning about different time signatures like 5/8 and 7/8 and cut time. So that's kind of my year at a glance, and these are a few extra tips that I have for you for your beginning percussion class. I like to do chair tests on Tuesdays. I tried doing chair tests on Mondays, and I also tried doing them on Fridays, and neither of those days worked for my kids. It just made them stress out a lot, and it made them more scared and anxious more than, oh, this is like Miss H watching us and having to see how well we're doing individually. So I've heard them called down the rows or DTRs. I've heard them called playing tests, chair test, whatever you want to call them, you go right ahead. I call them chair tests. I do not, however, put my students in the order in which they place in their chair tests. I might tell them who made first chair and second chair, but I will never rearrange the class. I like to have more order with that and just put the kids in a spot where they work the best. And then something that I would talk about is once you have gotten to a good place where you feel comfortable doing mallets and pad, find a rotation that works for you. So I do usually a week on pad and then a week on mallets. And that usually seems to work pretty well for me. And then on specific things, you might want to spend a little bit extra time on those. So here are the more challenging topics that I wanted to touch on, and hopefully you find some exciting ways to teach these with your kids. So the first one is the ready and set position. So I tell my kids that their hands need to be at a 75-degree angle, and the ready position is when the sticks are down, and then the set position is when their sticks are up. So the first picture is when they're down, and when I was teaching this a few years ago, one of my kids yelled out that it looked like pizza, and that's what we kind of stuck with. So this is what we call down pizza. And then we talk about how getting from the parallel to the pad position to the up position is going to up pizza. So I like to use this as a game with the kids at the beginning of the year and just see who can get to those positions fastest and with the correct technique. And they seem to really enjoy that. You can also think of it as ready and set. It's really up to you, but down pizza and up pizza are what I like to use, and my kids really do love doing that. The second thing I would do is have a counting system in place. Abilene, we use a Eastman counting system here, so we use 1T Tata. That's to mostly keep the wind instruments all together, and so I teach my percussionists with that counting system as well. But because I was taught with the 1E ANDA system, that's kind of more natural to me. So eventually, sometime in 6th grade, I like to tell the kids that there are several different counting systems and that they're basically the same. And so they learn both. And I think this has been a really good transition for them because going from middle school to high school, I'm able to explain more complicated rhythms with the 1E ANDA counting system versus the 1T Tata. So with starting mallets, something that we like to do in our school district is use some chants. I've seen some on like Teachers Pay Teachers and things like that. So we have a staff chant, and then we also have a key signature chant that we like to do. And it basically just goes key of C, no flats, no sharps. And then we just keep going with every key and list all the sharps and list all the flats. And it's a really good way for the kids to memorize their keys. I also really like to use the circle of fourths, not the circle of fifths. And I know that's a very small difference, but the way that this picture is written out, if you go around the circle clockwise, it ends up spelling bead GCF. And that's a really good way for the kids to remember the order of all the keys, the order of the flats. And then for the sharps, we use the saying, fat cats go down alleys eating birds. So this is the circle that I generally use when I start teaching mallets with my kids, and it seems to really help because they can memorize the order of BGCF, and it's just pretty easy for them to figure out where everything goes on in the circle. So when I teach dotted notes, this is something that I struggled with my first year. And obviously everyone knows what a dot does to a note. It adds half of the original value to the original value. But I came up with this, is that a dot means 3. So I tell my kids that a dot means 3 of something. So if they are looking at the note ratio chart that we have at the beginning of the book, and a note ratio chart is basically whole, half, quarter, eighth, 16th note, and it just shows the chart of like how the notes break down. If you just add a dot to a whole note, that would be 6 beats, right? Because we're adding half of 4 to 4, so you get 6. But if the kids know that it means 3 of something, then all they need to do is just know that it means 3 of the next note in the chart, which would be a half note. So 3 half notes would be the same equivalent as a dotted whole note. In the same idea, a dotted half note would be 3 quarter notes, and so on and so forth. I really like this way of teaching it because the kids only have to remember that it's 3. That's all they ever have to remember for dots. So with diddles, this is probably one of the more difficult topics that we teach in beginning percussion because it's the beginning of the process of rolls. And when we start teaching diddles, we really want to make sure that the kids are not changing how they are hitting the pad. One of the very first things that we go over in 6th grade percussion is paradiddles. And so when I teach the kids about diddles, I like to tell them that we're not changing anything. We just see a note and it has a slash through it. And when you see that, it just means to split it. It just means to play 2 of that note on the same hand. And all we're doing is just playing 2 right hands. You're not changing anything. So here's an example. So as you can see, I did not use fingers at all. I only used wrist, and I made all of my strokes the exact same height. When we are learning diddles, I usually set the metronome at 35 beats per minute on the met and put 16th notes on, and that's how slow we play. So that would be diddles, and then here's the transition into actual rolls. So when the kids need to go faster, we need to start incorporating finger. And that seems to be a bit more challenging for the students to kind of comprehend and understand. So I like to use the open close method is what I call it. I know their book talks about using 1 wrist stroke with 2 finger strokes. But when I do that, they get a little confused. So we want to make sure that they're understanding that you're going to do 2 finger strokes for 1 wrist stroke. And when you're doing that, each finger stroke is going to have a movement of the fingers. So here's an example. So in the video, I did 2 finger strokes with 1 wrist stroke. On the first stroke, I opened my fingers. Notice that I did not take them off the stick, but I just opened them enough for the stick to move. And I did rebound that stick to where it came all the way back up. On the second stroke is when I went down and closed my fingers on the rebound. So that's why I call it the open and close. As you do this and run drills with your students on this, they will get faster, but this seems to help them be able to start using their fingers in a more appropriate way. For roles, I like to give the students a role formula. This works for every single role that they learn in beginning percussion for all the open roles, and then you can transfer it to your buzz roles as well. So I like to tell them that there's 2 notations. There's the way that it's played, which is the first one in this picture, and then there's the way that it's written, which is the second one. The first one shows actual diddles. So we usually in class, when we're playing that first rhythm, we'll say diddle, diddle, hit. And that is giving the kids a mnemonic device on how it's supposed to sound when they are hitting the pad. But what I like to tell them is that on the actual notation, where it's the 8th note with the slashes through it, you take the note with the slashes through it and ask how many 16th notes are in that note. In this case, there are 2 because that's an 8th note. So you take the number of 16th notes in the slash note, you multiply it by 2 because we are diddling it, and then you add 1 for the downbeat, and that comes out to a 5-stroke roll. I like to give them this rule of rolls so that they know this is 100% how you figure out what kind of roll it is. The next thing that I like to touch on with my students is the 4 main types of strokes. So we want to go over full strokes, down strokes, tap strokes, and up strokes. So here's an example. As you can see in the video, I went in the order of full, down, tap, up. I like doing it that way because each previous stroke leads into the next one. This is really important that they understand the difference between the 4 strokes, especially when they start learning about accents and taps and then different accent patterns, because all 4 of these strokes will be used. Next is going into rudiments. And when we start talking about rudiments, it's really important that you keep talking about the 4 main stroke types while learning the rudiments. So this makes students aware of every movement and where their sticks are at the moment of execution. I think this is very important when I'm teaching my students, because then they become more aware of what they're doing at every second of the stick moving in the process. So the first one, I have 2 flams on the right hand and then 2 flams on the left hand written. And this may look a little complicated at first, but I promise if you do this with your kids, it will help in the long run. I usually write this on the board and we talk about what kind of strokes each of these notes are doing. I refer to these as the grace notes and the big notes. And on that first flam, I have that the big note is a full stroke and the grace note is a tap stroke, because we're just going to rebound into another right flam. So because we're doing 2 right flams in a row, that very first one, you're just going to rebound everything. On the second flam, because we're switching into a left flam, that changes what kind of strokes they are. So because you're already set for a right flam and the big note is already up and the grace note is down, you're going to do an upstroke with the grace note and a downstroke with the big note, and that actually turns it into a left flam, and then the student is ready to play that left flam next. On the example at the bottom, I have right and left flams alternating instead of 2 on the same hand and then 2 on the other hand. So in this case, those would be the same kind of strokes, but different hands. So because the flam is switching from a right flam into a left flam, you have to do the exact same kinds of strokes on each of the kinds of notes, if that makes sense. So this is a really important thing that I've noticed with my kids, and they seem to really understand the process of rudiments a lot better when I've broken it down with them on the board, and we've really thought about what kinds of strokes each note is going to go through. I like to do this with flams, flam taps, flam accents, and flam accues. And then we eventually get into like flam paradiddles and things like that. But this really seems to help them when they're learning their rudiments. So thank you so much for coming to my clinic today. I'm so glad you were able to come. My contact info is listed here. And if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to send me an email, and please join us for the live Q&A right now.